The secret to retirement on just one property through commercial property rather than residential in your super. Most Australians forget about their supers, and they think of it as an afterthought in their 40s and 50s trying to hit retirement and wondering if they could use their super to get them there. Most of the time, your financial planners or your retail funds are putting it everywhere else, and when you retire, what they expect you to do is draw down that capital. But what happens to that situation is you hack away at the tree and you end up not having a willable asset to give to your kids. But the fact is, the longer you live, the poorer you're going to get. And you don't want to be 90 something going on welfare, getting $400 a week from the government, right? What I'm about to show you in this video is how you can utilize one property, one strategy in your self-managed super fund to get you to retirement to replace an income, after tax income, of almost $80,000. So let's go. How many properties do you need to retire on? That actually comes back to how much cash flow you need to retire. Some people need first class flights to Europe and they want to have your first luxury holidays in all 5-star hotels. That might be a $500,000 retirement. Now for the average Australian, most people, the average wage is about $80,000. So if you could replace that in the next 7, 9, 10 years without you actually lifting a finger, and actually doing it in the background, that is the key to actual true financial success. And I'm going to share that with you in this video, exactly the pathway to do it. But there's a few elements you need to think of. There's actually 3 major elements. Firstly, tax, because you've got to consider tax. The higher you pay in tax, the less you bring home, right? So you need to look at the best tax advantages. Number 2, capital growth. How much capital growth should you be anticipating, calculating, and how you should be conservative, right? And it's very, very hard to control that in the residential environment. So a lot of people just think, do I need 5 properties? Do I need 2 properties? And the real answer is you only need 1 property. In commercial, you just do it again and again, that 1 property. And you can do it in super. So your self-managed super fund in the background while you're doing your full-time job, running after your kids, doing whatever you need to do, living your life as you would, but having it, building up the nest egg in the background for you so that you can retire to replace your income of $80,000 as an average Australian. Now, the figures I'm going to share with you can go larger, smaller, depending on whether you want to retire on $150,000 passive income, $250,000, or $1 million. One of the big things that I do here in my company here, Unicorn, is help everyday Australians build out their portfolios. I've built $50 million portfolios for individuals. I have built $10 million, $2 million, even as little as $500,000 or $1 million portfolios for the individual, right? I believe in helping the everyday Australian because that's how we get ahead as a nation, but that's also how we build wealth, right? It's from the small things, big things grow, right? Remember, I bought my first commercial property for $360,000 and sold it 9 years later for $1,050,000. That's what I'm going to share with you in this video, those 3 factors. So 3 factors. Number 1, we need to consider tax. Number 2, we need to consider growth. Number 3, the fundamentals is cash flow, because at retirement, if you don't have cash flow, you have nothing, right? So I'm going to take you through step by step my calculations of what you need to do in your superannuation. Now, there's a couple of things we need to do beforehand. Firstly, you need to set up a self-managed super fund. Now, I'm not an accountant, I'm not a financial planner. This is general advice, but this is what I see, and this is what I have seen my consultants help our clients do, is set up their self-managed super fund. Now, you need a specialist accountant or a financial planner to help you do that. Here at Unicorn, we can help you with that support as well. So you have your starting point, which is your self-managed super fund. You've got money in your retail fund. So what happens is when you go to work, they deposit the money into things like your Host Plus and just funds that are just managing that super money, and gradually it will build up over time, except you've got no control. So most people want to shift it into a self-managed super fund. So in self-managed super fund, you get control of how you invest your money. And most of the people who set up self-managed super funds, so like 80-90% of people who set up self-managed super fund, invest that money into property, right? So for you, let's say that you start out, you're in your mid-40s, right? Or perhaps late 40s. You're in that mid-40s. You've got about $300,000. It doesn't matter. It can be combined. It can be just yourself. It could be that you have in your super. Now, we're moving that into a self-managed super fund. That's your step 1. Now, let's say that you earn the average Australian wage of $80,000 a year and you want to retire on replacing your wage. And you don't really have a deposit outside because you've got your home, you're trying to pay off your home, you might have one residential investment, but you want to find a way to be able to replace that $80,000 in the next 10 years. Now, there's a couple of ways, and I teach my clients how to do this through a trading up strategy in their self-managed super fund. Now, one of the strategies we do is, firstly, we need to target a high growth. So you're in your 40s, you can't touch your super for about 15 years till you're 60. So there's really no point to buy cash flow properties, because the cash sits there, it doesn't really do anything. The main thing you want to focus on at this point is growth. Now, when you buy a self-managed super fund, you've got a few tax benefits. One of them is capital gains tax. So later on when you sell it, it washes out between 10 to 15% of the growth of the property after all the expense are taken out, rather than 25 or 35% you pay outside, right? So let's say that you have $300,000, you've moved it into a self-managed super fund. With that money, you can then leverage it to 75% LVR. So you can borrow 75% on top of the $300,000 to buy $1 million property. So you're borrowing $750,000, you've got $300,000, you've put in the deposit, and you've got $50,000 for costs. And that's your stamp duty, your legals, etc., right? So that, basically takes out that $300,000. Now, if you have an additional $10,000, it's worthwhile to keep it there as a bit of a buffer, but that's roughly around that area. Or you can reduce it to $950 or go above, depending on what you have. So $300,000, buying $1 million property. Now, interest rates are high in commercial property inside super. It's not high in commercial property outside. Now, interest rates are higher in self-managed super fund than it is outside of self-managed super fund, typically about 1 to 1.5%. So you're going to hold this property. So you bought $1 million property, and you're going to hold this property for 5 years. You're focused on a high growth property. So this property needs to give you 40% growth over the next 5 years, which is not a huge amount. When you look at residential, you actually expect more. In commercial, I've really made this conservative. So let's say you're buying $1 million, 40% over 5 years is $1.4 million that it's going to be worth at the end of 5 years. Now, you're going to be buying into this property because it's high growth in a metro area. So we're talking about Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Gold Coast, any of the metro areas, not Perth. Perth is not considered a metro area with the same growth rate as the cities on the eastern seaboard. Now, you're buying probably $1 million, and the yield you're trying to hit is 6%. Now, it doesn't matter if it's an office space, a retail space, or a warehouse space. The property itself doesn't matter, as in the defined growth rate, right? So you need to get to 40% within 5 years. So what you do is you take so 1 million, 1.4 million is the outcome, right? In 5 years time. Now you're borrowing 750,000. Right now, let's average the interest rate you're going to pay over those 5 years. Now at the moment, it's somewhere sitting around 7.7%, because outside of super is about 6.5 to 6.7. Now, interest rate will come down, so your rate inside super will come down. So let's just average it out of the 5 years at 7.5% to be conservative. So if we're averaging it out over the years at 7.5%, you're paying $56,250. So 56250 in the repayments of that year, or per year on interest only. Now, with properties in super, you need to do principal and interest repayment, but remember, you're working and you're contributing to your super. If it's just one of you on $80,000, every year you're contributing about $10,000 into super. Now, if it's two of you on that same $80,000, you're both contributing $20,000. But let's just assume it's only one of you contributing $10,000 to super. Very, very conservative. But remember, it's a 6% yield on the $1 million you bought as the yield of the property, right? And that's what makes commercial property so special, because residential is negative, whereas commercial is positive, is giving you cash flow, even at that high interest rate of 7.5%. So now you've got about $3,250 a year coming from the cash flow of the property in super, plus your $10,000. So it's about $13,000 that's in your super that's helping to pay down that principal, which should be enough stretched out in the longer loan terms. Now, you will hold this property for 5 years. Now the property is worth $1.4 million. You will then sell the property. Now, yes, I know there's costs of coming in and out, but you've got to think about the selling to trade up, right? So you sell the property, 1.4 million, you sell it. Let's take out some taxes, and so you've made the capital gains of 400,000. Let's take out some taxes. Let's take out some agents' fees. Let's say that you end up in your hand somewhere around that $320,000, right? And so you got your original 300 back, which you paid for the deposit. You've got your 320 from the capital gains, and then remember, each year the properties contributed around 13,000 a year. Remember, there's also compounding growth on the rent. So if we average that out at 15,000 a year, for round numbers sakes, you actually have in hand $665,000 now, right? So you've actually doubled the money you had in super within 5 years. That's phenomenal. You'll never be able to do that in a fund outside. But now you're doing this while you're working. So while you're doing your life, this is doing for you in the background. So it's totally passive in one property, right? So you sell the property, you now buy again. You do the same thing, but now you have a smaller leverage. Instead of leveraging 75%, you're now leveraging 70%. So you're actually having a lower LVR and you're leveraging a little bit lower to give you a bit more security because a little bit older, you're 5 years down the track. So you're 665 at 70% LVR, buying you $1.9 million. So you've actually jumped a couple of brackets in terms of purchasing power, right? So now you're buying 1.9. Now you want to do this again, but you can afford to be a little bit conservative now, right? So you can find something maybe with a slightly higher yield. Maybe let's take into account that things will change, right? So we're taking account in this lesson the differences in terms of getting your yield at that time in 5 years, the price point, the taxes, the growth, and the cash flow. So let's say we're only going to get 20% now over a 5-year period in the next 5 years. So you've done your first 5 years where you got high growth. Let's say we go to median growth the next 5 years and we still keep our yield at 6%, right? So we're not, expecting huge things. This is very conservative. So we're now looking at 4 to 5% growth a year out of a property. Simple, right? Very, very easily done in the commercial space in terms of buying in metro areas. So we're 6% still, we're buying a 6% property. And so that in the end of 5 years, so let's say you started at 40 when you did this with 300K, you're 45 doing the second lot, right? When you finish, you'll be at 50, right? So let's say that, or you started at 45 and you'll be at 55 at the end of it, right? So this is particularly useful for someone who's starting out in their mid 40s. This is particularly relevant if you're in your mid 40s, haven't started thinking about retirement to try to start to build a nest eggs, because within 10 years you can get there. So let's say the second half, you've gone from 1.9 million in 5 years time is now worth 2.3. So that's $400,000 growth, 20% growth on the 1.9 million, right? So it's 2.3 million, right? So now you sell, you do this again, you sell. But while you kept the property over the 5 years, the interest rate, let's still worked it out at 7.5%, which would probably be high during that time, but let's still keep it there to be really conservative. The net rent at 6% on 1.9 million is 114,000. What you need to pay the bank is about 99,750. So you're clearing about $14,000, a little bit more than $14,000 per year. But remember, you're still contributing $10,000 a year in there from basically your work contributions, right? So what you see here is you not actually having to quit your job, change anything. You're still in your same job for 10 years and you're putting in the $10,000, right? So now each year you've got about $24,000 that's paying back the principal, right? And you've had in 5 years time, $400,000 in growth, right? Over that time. If you sold out then, let's work the numbers. You had your original 665,000 and you have your 400K. And then you've added in during that time another 120,000 or so from your contributions and the property giving your contributions. Let's take out some taxes, your stamp duty, all of those things, and you end up in hand somewhere around that $1 million mark. You'll end up in hand about $1 million in cash, right? So in 10 years time, you've taken 300K and tripled it, right? With a little bit more contribution, you probably get to 1.1 million. So you can really triple that and more, right? Quadruple it, right? And so at this point, if you want to retire at 55 or in 10 years time at 50 or 55, depending on when you start, you can use that cash and go and buy a high yielding commercial property at 7% in regional. And that's going to give you $70,000 in passive income. Now, you might think, well, I haven't replaced my 80,000, but remember your 80,000 is actually before tax. So after tax, you're getting somewhere around that 68, 70,000. And when you go to 55, you can transition to retirement. When you get to 60, you're at the moment with the current legislation, it's capital gains tax-free and it's capital gains tax-free and it's income tax-free. So that's $70,000 when the time you hit 60 becomes income tax-free, which means that you essentially have replaced your income because that's what you take home. Now, on a wider note, I would spend that last 5 years throwing everything I can in super, try to bulk that 1 million up to 1.5 million by rinse and repeating again, so that I could retire somewhere around that $110,000 a year in passive income. So you can see that in commercial property, you only really need one property, but you need one property and the right strategy to get ahead. So again, if that's what you're looking for, reach out to us, link is below. In the meantime, subscribe, hit the bell. See you next video.